One of the biggest mistakes we make is making our grazing prescriptive, even when we don't realize it.
Dr. Alan Williams is back with us today as he walks us through several things that can increase productivity and profitability through your grazing management. From the initial management in the early part of the grazing season to the rule of compounding, and a great discussion we're going to have on weeds.
Define a weed. And I have never once received a definition of a weed that is objective. Every single definition that anybody, including weed scientists, that they have ever given me is purely subjective.
We'll conclude our discussion with a practice that really is quite simple, but rarely practiced.
Slow down. You're not being lazy when you spend time observing.
Grab your pen and paper. Grazing School is now in session, and this is one you don't want to miss on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Man, oh man, do we have a whale of a show lined up for you here today. Hi, everyone. This is Justin Mills, and you're listening to the Working Ranch Radio Show. Dr. Alan Williams back with us, as you heard there at the top of the program today, sharing with us some grazing tips. This is a program, folks, I can tell you right now, that you're going to be able to listen to year over year and pull something from it, or rewind, go back and listen to it again and do that. If you're listening on the radio and you want to go back and do that, you can go to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com, or you can go to your preferred podcast provider, download it, listen to it again. There's a lot of great information in today's show. We're going to get to that in just a few moments. Hey, for those of you that listened through the entire show last week, you were very well aware of the fact that we did a giveaway. It was for a set of leather coasters. You can put your ranch name on it or get ones that say Working Ranch Radio Show on it. But it was simple. All you needed to do was submit via text at 307-363-COWS this answer to the question: what is your favorite breed of cow dog? And for those of you that did, you were submitted into the drawing. We'll be drawing that out later on in the show. I will reveal who that was that won it, as well as the breeds and how that vote took place. So be sure to tune in later on for that. And of course, meteorologist Don Day will be in later on with a look at our long-term weather. Hey, the latest issue of Working Ranch magazine is out. It is the summer edition that is out. If you don't have a subscription, you can start it by easily going to workingranchmag.com, or you can stop by your local Tractor Supply store and pick one up off the rack. And a shout out to the Tractor Supply stores in Minot, North Dakota, and in Hendersonville, Tennessee, and in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Well, as we turn towards our subject here today, joining us on the program, again, back with us, very pleased to have him here, Dr. Alan Williams, who's a founding partner of Understanding Ag LLC and Regenified. Dr. Williams, good to have you today here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
That's great to be here, Justin. I really appreciate the opportunity.
When I reached out to you earlier this spring, really knowing that we kind of have our grazing season ahead of us, and I wanted to kind of just go through just maybe about 10 different things here to just be aware of as we're going through our grazing season. The first thing we started, we were kind of joking a little bit before we went on air here, was don't start spring grazing too early. But I think we can retrospectively talk about this, about not starting spring grazing too early. And I think the question for me has always been, well, I've got cattle, and once that green grass is starting to come, it is hard to keep them not wanting to graze.
Well, you're exactly right about that. And interestingly, I just got a text from one of our clients in Iceland this morning.
Okay.
And they have not yet started grazing.
Oh.
But he was sending me a screenshot of their temperature and weather projections for the next week and said, okay, looking pretty good. We're finally warming up and maybe we can get rolling here. But really, there's several things we need to consider about getting started when we're grazing in the spring. The ideal situation would be if we have built and reserved enough stockpile to both use the stockpile in the winter and then reserve some of that stockpile for the very first grazing in the spring, as we're getting that spring green up, right? Because that's far better than putting them on that really short, lush stuff, right off the bat. Several things with that. First, it's trying to get a start, and here we are nipping it off, right away and sort of setting it back from that fast start. But then secondly, it's going to be super high protein. And so we're going to have a lot of cattle with loose running manure, and those types of things. And if that's prolonged, that can lead to issues later down the road, like pink eye outbreaks, foot rot outbreaks, that kind of thing, because it does cause stress. It can then lead to some of these other issues that we're not attributing, to that incident of, being loose and runny for 2-3 weeks or so in a row. But that being said, if you're not at the point where you have built enough stockpile, then that's certainly one of the things that we want to work towards, right? Is always building and reserving stockpile for the winter and first grazing in the spring. And what that does is, in that stockpile pasture that we're starting in, they're forced to take a bite of the old every time they're trying to take a bite of the new. Mm-hmm. So that's going to sort of balance their diet out, prevent them from just chowing down all the new. And that allows all of our other pastures to get a better degree of maturity on those forages before we're finally out there hitting them. However, if that is not the case, and you're sort of in your first year of this transition, then one of the best things to do is, keep feeding them hay. Okay. And then start looking at your pastures. If at all possible, start with the one that has jumped and developed the most, the quickest. I really like to, on a lot of these pastures, I like to get, a reasonable degree of growth, several inches plus of growth before I'm out there grazing. Now, of course, I'm in Mississippi and I'm in the deep South. And I know that, we got people all over the place, but we work with people in all 50 states, Canada, you name it. So I'm intimately familiar with those situations. But, keep them on hay just a little bit longer, even though, yes, they really, really want that fresh green growth out there. And you really, really want to stop feeding hay. Yeah. Yeah. I know how that goes with us, too. We're just as anxious to stop feeding hay as the cows are to stop eating hay. But this will pay significant dividends. If you allow that forage base to get a little more growth on it, establish a little deeper root depth, and really get that biology going, what will happen here is you will grow much more forage over the total course of that season versus if you get on it too early.
You bet. Okay, let's move on to number 2 here, and that is, and it was interesting because before we went on air, we were talking about, where we were at moisture-wise, and some areas really seeing a lot of moisture, other areas particularly dry. A couple clients you had talked about. Tip number 2 is hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And so even with our spring grazing, even when we think we have plenty of moisture in the ground, do not let them take too much. We want to always reserve enough residual, enough growth to keep the soil absolutely as covered and protected as possible. We want to keep enough leaf material so that photosynthesis can continue to occur. And we want to make sure that we're reserving stockpile going into those hotter, drier periods. And that's got to start now. You can't do that after we already turn off hot and dry. And there's none of us that can predict exactly when the spigot is going to turn off each and every year. And for some, as we talked about, that spigot hadn't even turned on.
Yeah.
So, again, if you haven't reserved stockpile, you're going to be in trouble. And let's just briefly talk about the rule of compounding here relative to that. So if we take it down too far, we're going to have a whole host of negative compounding effects. Number one, taking it down too far allows more sun to hit the soil surface, and particularly out west and here in the deep south both, that means our soil temperature can heat up to 140 to 180 degrees. Last year out west in the Nebraska Sandhills, I measured a soil temperature of 183 degrees.
Oh, my.
That's horrible.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
sterile.
Justin, I don't know about you, but I don't even cook my meats to that temperature. I consider them burned and ruined.
Yeah.
Okay? So think about, we literally are cooking the soil at that, right? So, temperatures in the hundreds, particularly 120 and above, which is way too easy to do. We have lost 85 to 100% of our moisture in the top few inches of soil, and we've killed all our microbes in the same top few inches of soil. So now we have a significant moisture loss, and we have significant nutrient deficit because the microbes aren't there to cycle those nutrients. So that's one thing that's occurring in terms of compounding effects. The other is we have quite a bit of root die-off. And as those roots die off, the living portion of the root then gets closer and closer to the soil surface. And that's when we desperately need to be able to reach the moisture deeper in the ground in that soil profile. But now our plants cannot because the root depth is too shallow. So we get too much root die-off. As we have root die-off, that also means we have microbes that go dormant deeper in the soil because they live in association with the roots, as we said earlier. And so now they're not able to go to work feeding nutrients to the plants because the plants aren't feeding them root exudates. We also don't have enough shading on the soil surface because we didn't leave enough leaf material. And we also don't have enough sunlight capture for photosynthesis to be occurring and more rapid recovery of the plant. So
it just
again,
compounds.
We don't want those negative compounding effects.
Yeah, it's like what you said. It's the compounding. It just, once that ball's rolling, it's hard to turn it back, isn't it?
It really is. So always be thinking ahead. Never assume that conditions are going to stay good. The very best thing you can always do is leave plenty of residual behind on any grazing event and plenty of stockpile ahead.
Okay. All right. Let's take a break here. When we come back, I want to talk about weeds. And I didn't notice I had put an S on that because if I said I want to talk about weed, it'd probably get different types of listeners here. But I want to talk about weeds. You're smiling at me here. That's one of the things, in amongst some other things. We'll get to that when we come back after the break. When it comes to building fence, driving those steel posts can be exhausting and absolutely backbreaking. But there is another way you could be doing this. Now, I'm not talking about those bulky and expensive gas-powered or hydraulic pounders. What I'm talking about is the Man Saver Post Driver. Yeah, it's called the Man Saver Post Driver by Roar Manufacturing. This is a portable, lightweight, easy-to-use post driver that runs off of any small air compressor and is 100% made in the USA. The Man Saver Post Driver comes in a variety of models from driving posts ranging from vineyard stakes to T-posts and all the way up to 3.5-inch diameter posts. While it may be called the Man Saver Post Driver, shoot, I've heard some go as far as calling it the Marriage Saver Post Driver. But take a look for yourself. See it in action when you go to their website at roarmfg.com. That's ROHRERMFG.com. Or if you want to talk to a real person, give them a call at 800-980-7599. The Man Saver Post Driver, the portable, lightweight, and easy-to-use pneumatic post driver where the name speaks for itself. All right, Alan, as we continue on looking at tips and things that we need to be thinking about as we look ahead for what we all want is a successful grazing season. And of course, for a lot of us, we're thinking, you give me moisture and I will have a successful grazing season. But I had teased the fact that we were going to talk about weeds coming up. Before we hit that, one topic I want to hit a little bit and have you, I think for some folks, they may have heard this, but to kind of make sure we are all on the same page with that. And one of the tips was do not overgraze. And we can all say, oh yeah, well, I agree with that. I think the definition of what we're calling overgrazing maybe is not as clear.
That's exactly correct. And I was actually on a client's place this morning. And he had overgrazed, but he was not thinking he was overgrazing, right? And again, we've had plenty of moisture. Temperatures have been on the cooler side up till now. But as I said, we've got a heat dome that's going to start next week. Moisture is going to be cut off. We're all of a sudden going to be 20 plus degrees hotter than we are right now. And those areas that he allowed him to take it down too much, he's going to be in trouble. But he had the area that they were in today that he had just turned them in yesterday. And I asked him, I said, how long were you planning on leaving them in here? And he told me, probably, 2 or 3 more days. And I said, no, you need to stop now. This is what you need to be leaving. So we had good trample, virtually no exposed soil, plenty of leaf residue left for photosynthetic activity and shading of the ground and all of that. And he looked at me just a little quizzically, and said, really? I need to leave now? And I said, yeah. I said, this is your target. This is what you need to be leaving every single time. I said, if you leave this much, you will grow much more in a single grazing season. But if you go over here to where they took it down pretty tight, I said, look at all the bare soil that you can see now, and the sun broke out. And I said, look at where the sun is hitting the ground. Look at how much soil without a plant intercepting that sunlight the sun is hitting. And it immediately started resonating with him. And we went through that, rule of compounding. Over here, you're going to have negative compounding effects. Over here, if you leave now and go to the next pasture, you're going to have positive compounding effects because you left plenty of residuals. So that's really the key. The other thing, he's in the middle of, breeding. And I said, when you're taking it down too tight, what's happening is when you first turn them on those pastures, the first couple of bites of a plant, they're on a inclining plane of nutrition, right? But as they bite further and further down on that same plant, which is exactly what has happened here, you're going to be on a declining plane of nutrition. So every time you do this and you turn them into a new spot, they're going up and then down, up and down. And that's not what you want in the breeding season. You want a pretty constant inclining plane of nutrition. But if you leave it like this, they're only taking the first two bites of any plant, and now your breed up's going to be better, and you're going to produce anywhere from 2 to 3 times more total forage biomass in this exact same growing season.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yep. Very good. Okay, now let's talk about the weeds, and let's get into the weeds on the weeds, shall we? And that is, I thought it was interesting because your tip was don't sweat the weeds. And I think for a lot of us, boy, we're just like, oh man, we want this clean, nice, tidy pastures, but there could be some reasoning there.
Well, first of all, what we have to understand, and I've asked this question, define a weed over and over again, practically every time I speak in anywhere in the world that I speak. And I've asked this in front of audiences that have included, university faculty, extension personnel, NRCS personnel, on and on. And I have never once received a definition of a weed that is objective. Every single definition that anybody, including weed scientists, that they have ever given me is purely subjective. So the definition of a weed is in the eye of the beholder, But what we have to understand, number one, is that everywhere in the world, there are literally dozens and dozens of different weed seeds in every seed bank. But we never grow dozens and dozens of them. It's only a handful growing and dominating at any one given time. Well, why is that?
Yeah.
Well, it's because nature is intentionally selecting the plants we call weeds, or these forbs, to grow at that very specific point in time to correct something that's wrong in the soil. And almost always is something we did, in our management that caused something to be wrong. So nature knows which seed to cause to germinate, to grow at that particular point in time. And if we spend all of our time trying to immediately get rid of them, guess what? They're going to keep trying to grow because nature has not been able to resolve the problem. So if we let them grow and resolve the problem, rather than trying to get rid of them, what we will find is that they're successionary. And once the problem is corrected, whether it's an imbalance in nutrients, too much, too little, whether it's soil compaction and lack of aggregation, whatever the case may be, once they fully correct that problem, they recede back in the seed bank, and then other plants that we may deem more favorable would then begin to grow in their place. Now, the other strategy is that where we have these areas where we may think we have a lot of weeds, whether it's thistle, whether it's leafy spurge, whether it's, smooth brome or reed canary grass, we can keep naming, but one of the other strategies is to use an ultra high density impact. So ultra high stock density, where I have at least 500,000 to 1 million pounds per acre in a long, narrow paddock where they just go back and forth and get a really high degree of trample. I'm not asking them to eat a lot of it, okay? What I'm asking them to do is trample the heck out of it. And with that intense hoof action, stimulate the latent seed bank, and they're going to be dumping a lot of manure and urine, so they're going to fertilize what is stimulated in the latent seed bank. and they're going to be shedding a lot of microbes that are further going to stimulate the latent seed bank to respond. So really what I'm trying to do is I call it insulting the plant that I'm targeting, whatever it is. Insult it by a high degree of trample and then stimulate. I'll set it back then and stimulate other things to grow. Now, the timing of this, Justin, is critically important.
Okay.
So whatever the plant is that you're targeting, you don't want to hit it when it's young and tender and vegetative. Because if you try to trample it then, you're just spurring it on. Okay. It'll come back with a vengeance. And then you'll say, well, Alan, you were wrong. It didn't work. No, the timing was wrong. What you want to do is you want to let it get enough maturity to it. And this means, basically a little bit beyond the boot stage, meaning that you've got some seed heads beginning to appear. Okay. Again, on whatever plant it is. That means that the stems of the plant have enough lignification in them that as they trample it, they crimp it.
Okay.
And that really sets it back. So the timing is important. And once you do that, then you've provided that stimulatory effect with that high stock density that the other things will begin to grow and outcompete it. So those are really, the keys there to managing that.
Something else that you wrote in one of these was there could be some beneficial things that those cows would turn to on those weeds that they take, whether it's for parasite control, self-medicating, deworming. Kind of explain that a little bit, because I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So ideally, at all times in our pastures and on our rangeland, we want a really good mix of grasses, legumes, and forbs, what most people call weeds. Okay?
Yeah.
We don't want to be weed free. That's just not the case at all, because we're actually working against ourselves, against soil health, and against animal health if we do that. So I like at all times a good mix of forbs. And if we look at our native grasslands and prairies and savannas across North America, originally when they were being managed by the large herds of bison, elk, antelope, and so forth, their typical composition was somewhere about 40 to 50% grasses. So they weren't all grass like we imagine today, with about 30 to even as much as 40% forbs. That's why the prairies were colorful. They had a lot of flowering plants, right? The real prairie, not the prairies we see today.
Yeah.
And they had native legumes. Okay. So the plants that contain the greatest medicinal value and even anti-parasitic compounds, they're contained within what we call phytonutrient compounds. Okay. And so it's the forbs, these plants that we call weeds, that have the strongest and most powerful medicinal properties, antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, and they contain compounds like tannins and other things that are very powerful dewormers. So our livestock can deworm themselves, and they can self-medicate if we have enough of these forbs for them to graze when they're grazing the grasses and legumes as well. And they know how much of each plant to eat, to accomplish that. We got to give them credit. And we got to remember who was deworming the bison, who was deworming the elk, who was deworming the deer and the antelope and all of that. Well, are they susceptible to parasites? Well, of course they are. Well, how come they all just didn't drop over dead from heavy parasite loads, and still don't today? It's because they're not nearly as constrained and confined by our fences, and they eat a much more diverse diet than we give to our cattle.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Not to belabor the weed conversation, but I'm intrigued by it because I think so often it's something we're trying to get rid of when reality is, as you had mentioned, something we need to, maybe there's a purpose for that. And one of the things I had written down in my notes is that every plant has a purpose and we need to try and understand that purpose. This is what you wrote. And then what is that particular plant trying to tell me? So my question is, how do I know that? I mean, what do I need to do to say, okay, I see this species of plant growing out there. Maybe it's not as desirable as another type or whatever that. How do I know what that, really to put a finite pin to that? What is that telling me? How do I know that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So first, there's a particular app that I like quite a bit, and I've used all over the world and found it to be highly reliable. It is called Picture This.
Okay.
And so if people want to be able to identify what's growing out there in terms of their plant species, just download Picture This, on your smartphone or tablet or whatever, and you can take pictures and it'll identify the plant, but it will also tell you about that plant.
Okay.
And the purposes of that plant. Okay. But secondly, there are some really good books that help you to determine, okay, if it's, let's say it's a thistle growing out there, or it's, in our country, something like dog fennel, or leafy spurge, or again, whatever the case may be, right? Then there are books that go through and tell us what that particular plant is trying to correct. And these books are Weeds, Control Without Poisons, Weeds, Guardians of the Soil, and I think it's Weeds and What They Tell Us. So there's some really good books out there, that go through this and give us a good explanation. So again, they all have a purpose. But as we remember, if we can train our cattle to eat them, and we absolutely can, okay, there's not a plant we have yet not been able to get our cattle to eat, and our sheep and everything else, then these plants are not devoid of nutrition themselves. They are very phytonutrient rich. So they actually do help our animals, not hurt them if they eat them.
Okay. All right. Good discussion. I think for a lot of us, as we said earlier, that we just have a tendency to think that, well, we got to get rid of them. All right. Let's take a break here. We still have a lot more to cover with Alan on our program. This segment today brought to you by ReoMax, the tub that pays for itself.
We've done a few manure studies on the ReoMax product. On average, we're seeing 51% less undigested feed in cows' manure that have been on ReoMax. She's digesting her feed that much better and getting that much more protein and that much more energy out of her feed stuff.
Basically, that saved 2 months worth of forage that we either would have grazed or we would have fed.
We just noticed that number of cows per day per acre probably increased 20 to 30%.
So we put ReoMax on one set of cows and not the others. In the fall, when we wean those calves, we put the two sets of calves right together. There's a visual difference. I would say 35 or 40 pounds heavier.
I think we've increased our weaning weights at least 50 pounds.
Yeah, it's going to usually pay for itself.
ReoMax, the tub that pays for itself.
To learn more, call 888-386-0699 or online at reomax.net. As we continue on, my guest here today is Dr. Alan Williams. He is one of the founding partners of Understanding Ag and also Regenified. And Dr. Williams, as we continue on now, let's talk about the rule of disruption. I think we're, as human nature is, we really like to have a formulaic approach to everything, like 2 + 2 = 4, and we do that every year. But I think when we're looking at this, and even I know when I talked to you previously and we were talking about adaptive grazing, there's a point of this that getting out of the habitual things of how things maybe were done years ago could help to be a good rule of thumb to think about. I'll let you expand on that.
Yeah, so one of the biggest mistakes we make is making our grazing prescriptive, even when we don't realize it. And often what happens is that we change something, which is a disruption, right? So this is going to lead us into the rule of disruption. So anytime we change something, we have disrupted it. And so we introduced a disruption and we saw a positive impact. But what's our human tendency? Oh, wow.
Do that next year.
I see a really good positive impact. I did this, so I'm going to do that from now on. That's the silver bullet, right? Well, no. So we took a disruption, but we made it prescriptive. It worked initially, but then it stops working. Over time, we sort of hit a wall, our progress stops, and then we start going backwards, and we wonder why. Well, I'm doing it the way I did it when it worked. What am I doing wrong now? Well, what you're doing wrong now is you're doing the same thing you did then. That's why in our 3 rules of adaptive grazing, we have the rule of disruption. If we want to make ongoing, continuous progress year after year after year, then we have to make planned, purposeful disruptions and routinely introduce those. And I think the last time I used the analogy of a human athlete,
Yep.
you know, that, and again, I'll just say it one more time to remind people, but, you know, for an athlete, we know that if we do the same exercise routine at the same duration and intensity, again, we're going to hit a wall. And then we're not even going to be able to maintain the same performance. We're going to start going backwards. So every athlete, if they want to continue to progress, knows they have to introduce planned, purposeful disruptions into their exercise routine. So it's no different out here on our farms and ranches. We got to do that. So what are then some of the disruptions we can introduce? Well, one is alter stock density, pounds of animals per acre, not number of head per acre, but pounds of animals per acre. I call it pulsing stock density. So don't pick a stock density. You know, if you hear me or Gabe or Greg Judy or anybody else talking about, well, here we used 100,000 pounds per acre or whatever it may be, and then you think, that's it, 100,000 pounds per acre. I got to keep it at that. No, you just made it prescriptive, and you're going to limit your progress. So, for instance, with us, we go anywhere from about our lowest at 20,000 pounds per acre to 1 million plus pounds per acre. Okay. And they're for different reasons. And the higher the stock density, the shorter the duration.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm at 1 million pounds per acre, it's 30 minutes and that's it. And I'm to the next paddock, right? If it's at 20,000 pounds per acre, I can do that the entire 24-hour period in that paddock. So you got to be cognizant of the impact of the stock density when we're altering stock density. Now, in some western areas where it's more arid, then a 20,000 pound stock density can at times be pretty high, you know, because your average may be under 5,000 or even under 2,000 pounds.
Yeah.
So it's all relative to where you're at. Another disruption is alter the rotation. So oftentimes when we come out of winter, we start in the same pasture every year, right? And make the same rotation. Well, next year, start in an entirely different pasture, you know, than where you started in this year. Or completely reverse your rotation. Go around the ranch the other way, okay? In your rotation. So alter rotation. Another is altering time or season of the year that I'm grazing in a particular area. And again, if we alter our rotation, then we're going to almost automatically alter the time or season of year. So I'm really sort of combining two disruptions into one. So don't always hit the same pasture in May, as an example, okay? Another is alter rest period. And way too many violate this. You know, they have almost the same rest periods time after time after time, no matter how long that rest period is, but intentionally alter the rest period. If you want to grow more diversity, you want to grow more rooting depth and root biomass and more forage biomass, you've got to give some longer rest. Okay? That's really going to be important.
Yeah.
Another disruption is to alter the height on and height off. In mid-grazing, you know, management-intensive grazing, we're taught always go on at this height and come off at this height. Well, no, that's highly prescriptive, and you're going to limit the ability of those pastures to produce. So alter height on and off. Other disruptions are things like planned burns, bale grazing, contour grazing, okay, where instead of grazing up and down contour, I graze across the contour, I follow the contour. And if I'm contour grazing, I'm always going to start low and move high. I'm not going to start up on the ridge and move down. Okay. Why? Because over the decades and centuries, we've had a lot of erosion and stuff, and we've got more carbon and more diversity and more biology low than we do high. So I want to use my livestock as a transport tool to move that back up. Okay. So start low and go high. Another one is alter direction of my paddocks. So as I'm building paddocks, let's say I've been building them east to west, next year build them north and south within the same bigger pasture in my subdivisions. Another is alter paddock shape or configuration. I don't get the same impact in a square paddock as I do in a long, narrow paddock. I'm going to have a different impact, even with the same acreage in the paddock and the same stock density. The animals move in a circular pattern in a square paddock, and they move back and forth in a long, narrow paddock. So paddock shape matters a lot. And then I can combine disruptions. So for instance, I can alter stock density, I can alter rest period, and I can alter paddock shape or configuration all in the same grazing event. So I've combined 3 disruptions into one grazing event, and that gives me even more impact and results at the end. So, you've got all of these different types of disruptions that we can implement and utilize, and we want to be cognizant of what disruption we use when. And next year, when we're back in that same area, I want to use a different disruption than I used the prior year. What we have found, Justin, in doing this, Gabe and I and others, in doing this for 30 years plus now, when we use this rule of disruption and we're routinely introducing these without becoming prescriptive, we have not hit a wall. We are continuing to make incremental, ongoing progress.
Boy, a lot to take in there. Very good stuff, Alan. Definitely a show here today, folks, that you're going to want to go back and listen to again, probably with a pen and a notebook so you can take down and jot down some notes and go back to it from time to time. We have one more segment with Alan, and it's the one thing that kind of could tie all of this together. We'll be back after this.
This year, choose to unlock the full potential of your cattle operation with K-Line Irrigation, the affordable and dynamic solution for grass-based livestock operations. Beat drought by planning ahead with the most user-friendly irrigation system. K-Line systems ensure optimal water distribution across all acres and are unencumbered by obstacles such as fence lines or steep terrain. Don't miss out on untapped pasture potential. Choose K-Line to secure the future of your grazing operation. For more information, visit our website at www.k-linena.com. Be sure to fill out a consultation form so our designers can create an estimate for your project. K-Line Irrigation, for greener, more productive pastures anywhere.
Okay, one more thing, one final thing before we go, and that is be a watcher. Pay attention. Be observant to what's going on. That's kind of the final thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another sort of human frailty, failing to observe as well as we need to. And particularly for men, because we start off each day with a checklist, right?
Yep.
And as men, we're like, okay, I got 10 things I'm going to do today on my checklist. Boom, 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 boom. All checked off. Yes. Look at the progress I made. So that's what we're concerned about. We're concerned about going down through each task and just checking it off. But we should be most concerned about, what am I observing that day? That's really, really critical. So what I want to tell people to do is slow down. You're not being lazy when you spend time observing. And again, that's tough for us guys to wrap our heads around, because we think we're being lazy if we stand there and look around, for 10, 15, 20 minutes, or if we sit in our buggy and look around for that amount of time. But that's the best spent time every day. Now, women are better at this, okay? They're just naturally better observers. And we have found this over and over when we teach, workshops and schools and so forth, that the women typically are better almost right off the bat at picking up differences in observations than the men are. But here's the deal. No observation is too small or unimportant. Every observation, if we keep making these observations, have meaning. So you want to observe a number of things. We'll run through those real quick. So first, you want to observe the prior day's grazing impact. Okay, what happened? Did it take too much? Did they take too little? What type of trample? How much residual did they leave? How much leaf material did they leave? How evenly is my manure and urine distributed? All of those types of things. What did they eat? Okay. What plants did they eat on today? And that can change depending on the pastures you're in and the time of year. that you're in those pastures, watch them. You'll find that they eat a lot more certain plants at a certain time of the year and a lot less of them at other times. Pay attention to that. Pay attention to the parts of each plant they're eating. That tells us a lot as well, because they don't eat the whole plant, you know? And so you want to know what parts of the plant are they really favoring. They're teaching us something, okay, and how we need to manage their grazing when you do that. You know, I particularly want to know what forbs did they eat today, because that's going to tell me a lot about their health needs and their parasite needs. Okay. Do they have a heavier parasite load right now? If so, I'm typically going to see that they've been eating on a lot of forbs that have a lot of tannins and things like that for deworming. So it sort of teaches me and helps me to track where they are in regards to parasite load. The other thing I want to observe is the manure pats. Okay. What do they look like? You know, do we have that nice round manure pat with that thick pancake batter consistency and a little dimple on top? Or is it really loose and runny and strung out? Or does it look almost like horse manure, you know, where you've got the dry segmented portions of manure in the patty? So that's going to tell us a lot about, are they consuming a balanced diet? Are they eating too much protein? Or are they not getting enough protein or energy and way too much fiber? So that tells me about my grazing management and what I'm turning them on to and sort of forcing them to eat. Pay attention to the gut feel of the cattle. You know, high on the left-hand side, back in the paunch area, between the last rib and the front of the pelvis, okay? That triangular paunch area. And if I'm giving them enough to eat, enough forage dry matter, it is not going to be concave or sunk in. It's going to be pushed out, either somewhat level, you know, with the ribs and the front of the pelvis, or even a little bit convex, sort of pushed out a little bit. Mm-hmm. That's telling me I'm giving enough forage dry matter to eat every day. I want to pay attention to their contentment level and their disposition. You know, how are they acting when I'm out there and I'm moving them to a new pasture and that type of thing? How much vocalization do I hear? You know, and how fast are they moving from the old paddock to the new paddock? That tells me a lot. I want to look at their hair coats. Are they shedding like they should in the spring and developing a nice, slick, oily sheen to their hair coat? Or are they really holding on to hair, and it's the hair they're holding on to dull and brittle? You know, because that's telling me, boy, they sure aren't firing on all cylinders, right? I want to observe the insects that are there. How many are there? When in a really, really good pasture, rangeland, every step we take, we should be kicking up clouds of insects. We should see a lot of pollinators out there as well. And I'm going to pay attention to the bird population. I should be seeing more and more birds if I'm managing my pasture and my rangeland well. So, you know, I want to pay attention to my plant species. Am I noticing more and more plant species appearing or less? If it's less, I need to really think about what I'm doing because I'm causing that. If it's more, then let's keep doing more of what we've been doing because, you know, we're in more of the disruptions because we want more diversity. I carry a shovel with me, so I'm going to dig in the soil and see what kind of impact the shovel test is showing me, you know, in that soil profile. So again, all of these are things that I pay careful attention to. I'm going to look, are they forming cow paths? You know, all of these types of things. Are they trailing? You know, because all of that is really my fault. I'm sort of the one forcing them to form a cow path or to trail and that type of thing. What's their fly pressure? You know, again, nothing is unimportant. And if I'm moving them more frequently and they know that, they're used to that, then as you move them from one pasture to the other, or one paddock to the next, then in just a few minutes, you're going to see every animal. Mm-hmm. And that's much easier and much better than having to ride a whole pasture trying to find every animal to see if they're healthy. So if they're moving, then I can quickly see, do I have a sick animal, an injured animal, an animal hanging back, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So it just makes our job so much better if we spend a lot of time in keen, purposeful observation. And the one thing that we know, Justin, is that the more we observe, the more intuitive we become. And the more intuitive we become, the better our decisions are. So I want to make good decisions. Mm-hmm. The only way I can make good decisions is to do enough daily observation.
Yeah, very good. Well, that's a perfect way to sort of end our conversation here today. I think the observation is a key thing in putting all of this together. And like you said, is it gives us that reason to move forward in all of that. Real quick, Alan, just if folks are wanting more information, of course, you are a consultant as well. You have a business that does that. How do they reach out to you to either ask questions or get with you on a consulting basis?
Absolutely. So they can go to our website at understandingag.com and email us there through the website, and we will all be reached that way. Or they can email me directly at Allen, A-L-L-E-N, Allen at understandingag.com. And we'll be very, very happy to address any questions or concerns that you have and help you in any way. Our website, Justin, as you know, is loaded with material. We have lots of articles that cover a lot of things we just talked about today.
Yeah.
We have podcasts, we have webinars, we have case studies, recommended reading, all of those types of things. So take advantage of all of the things that are free off of our website that will help you as you progress down this path.
You bet. Well, Alan, thanks for taking the time to do this today. Boy, I tell you what, we could make about 2 or 3 episodes with some of the stuff, because I know I was kind of cutting short. There was a few questions I could have asked more on this, but I also wanted to make sure we got through some of these things. Thank you for doing this and joining us here on the program today.
Well, thank you so very much. I have tremendously enjoyed it.
Dr. Alan Williams, our guest here today on the program, and I encourage you to bookmark this show or save it, download it. Every spring, go back and re-listen to this and just kind of get yourself recentered on some of the basic principles of good grazing. And I don't know if you're like me, but every time I have the opportunity to hear Alan talk, or the opportunity like we did today to visit with him, I feel 2 different things. Number 1, guilty for where I'm lacking, what I'm not doing right. And number 2, how well he explains it and details it out to realize that this is something that we all can be doing, and it doesn't require extensive degrees of understanding every little bits and pieces, but just doing the basic things that we talked about here today is very practical, and I appreciate what he brings to our industry and what he brought to our show here today. We're going to take a break, and coming up next, meteorologist Don Day is in with a look at our long-term weather.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the weatherstationexperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY, that's RAINDAY, for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
And as we return now, let's take a look at our long-range weather. Joining us is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, before we jump ahead and look what the next 7 to 10, 14 days out is going to look like, boy, this past week or so, there have really been some places that's gotten some moistures that really needed it. And if we were to look at drought monitor map from a couple of weeks ago to this past one, we're starting to see some of the red in some areas of the country starting to fade away.
Yeah, not only have we seen some movement in the drought monitor in some of the western high plains over the last week or two, but we got some very unusual rain because it doesn't rain very often in parts of the southwestern United States in the month of June at all. There are 2 areas where we've seen some movement, where rain over the last week, and really if you go back the last 3 or 4 weeks, is starting to put a dent in some of the severe drought areas of Wyoming, Nebraska, and South Dakota. Now, we still have a lot of dry areas, but we were able to get enough rain to move out of extreme drought conditions in some areas. And then I mentioned the southwestern United States. Just to give you an example, Phoenix averages 0.02 inches of rain in the month of June. And a lot of times, Phoenix won't get any rain at all in June. Now, as we know, the southwestern United States, Arizona, the southern Great Basin, Utah, New Mexico, the Four Corners area, all in very droughty conditions. They saw more rain here in the month of June so far than really all winter in some areas. There were places north of Phoenix that got over an inch of rain, and some rains fell in the deserts of California, rain in Las Vegas. So that is a good sign, I think. It not necessarily has to do anything to do with the summer monsoon, but when you start to see rain events like that, sometimes that's a little bit of a hint to what's coming later this summer in some areas. So actually have good news to report. Now, we still have some very dry areas in the Northwest Corn Belt that could use some rain, and that's the next area that we're going to be watching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as we look at this, the pattern that you're seeing as we start this month of June and in these first 7 to 10 days out, it kind of just looks like we're going to continue to see some of this weather that's going to produce moisture across these areas.
Yeah. For another week, I think we're going to hold off any real summer heat, any real hot summer conditions really everywhere across the United States. Now, the last 2 weeks of June, I do see things warming up. I do see things getting into a classic summer pattern. However, for another 7 to 10 days, there's a lot of the U.S. that will have below average temperatures. These rain chances are going to continue. So we're certainly not jumping quickly into summer, kind of ramping up into it, which is good. You never want to switch seasons like on a dime. You want to see that gradual trend, and that's what we're seeing. And I do think we're starting to see the benefits of where the pattern started to get more wet in some areas in April and May, and that's helping now as we are about ready to go into our summer months.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as we had talked about in our summer weather outlook, the wetter areas definitely produces is one of the things that you watch is that soil moisture content there. That helps to produce that, and it's kind of just keeps that ball rolling.
Exactly right. So a wet May and June equals a lot of times continued wetness in July and August. Not always, but it more often than not it does. So for another week to 10 days or so, we'll hold off summer. Your electric bill won't be running too high because of running your air conditioners. Second half of the month, as we peak into early July, is when things will start to heat up.
All right, Don, appreciate the update this week. Look forward to talking to you next week.
Sounds good.
And if you want to follow along each and every morning with meteorologist Don Day and his weather outlook, you can go to his website at dayweather.com, and there you will find a link to his YouTube channel. Up next, it's the results from the question I asked last week for listeners to enter in the giveaway on some leather coasters. What's your favorite breed of cow dog? Find out who won and what was the breed that received the most votes. That's coming up. Okay, so we had 9 different types of breeds submitted in the question that I asked last week of what is your favorite breed of cow dog? Folks from 11 different states sent me their answers on this. Here's what the results were. Catahoodle Blackmouth Cur, Border Collie, Australian Shepherd, Heeler Border Collie Mix, the Texas Heeler, which by the way I did not know this, is a Blue Heeler crossed on an Australian Shepherd or a Border Collie, the Blue Heeler, the Red Heeler, Hanging Tree, and the captain even threw in his vote of the Kelpie. So here's what I did when I tabulated it all out. It came up with a tie between the Border Collie and the Heeler, but the tiebreaker is going to go to the Border Collie because our winner for the leather coasters was Gary Materi out of Springdale, Arkansas, and his vote was a Border Collie. So congratulations, Gary. I'll get these Working Ranch Radio Show coasters sent to you, and thanks for everybody for submitting your answers. Thanks for joining us again on the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.